I'm Paul Burstein, chair of the Jewish Studies program, and I'd like to welcome you to the 29th annual Samuel and Althea Stroum Lectureship in Jewish Studies. For 29 years now, the generosity and farsightedness of the Stroums has made it possible for us to bring to this campus some of the most distinguished Judaic scholars from around the country and around the world, and that's a tradition that we're very happy to continue tonight. But I just want to remind everybody and like to say hi to Althea and to thank her again personally and on behalf of the Jewish Studies program. And on behalf of everybody else, which I think is very nice. Sam, as you know, is no longer with us. This would have been his birthday today, actually. He passed on about 3 years ago. But he certainly, his memory and his legacy certainly live on, and we're very glad to have Althea here today. The impact of these lectures goes far beyond the audience in this room. Over half of them have been turned into books published by the University of Washington Press, also with the generous support of the Stroums. The books have won prizes. They've been translated into multiple languages. They've sold tens of thousands of copies. They are used as texts all around the world, so that what people say in this room pretty often winds up affecting what people think about Jews, Jewish culture, the Jewish people all around the world. And so it's important to understand just how far the generosity of the Stroums extends here. Let me go on then to talk about tonight's lectures and lecturer. Jews are known as the people of the book, but that's not exactly true. It's not exactly a good way to put things. If we were just the people of the book, you wouldn't need to be here, okay? Professor Handelman could write a book and we could mail it to you, okay? But that's not the way it works. The way it works is something we've just seen during Passover, where the Seder seems to revolve around a book, in a way. We sit and we read it. But the essence of it really is the people asking the questions, coming up with the answers, and discussing the Exodus and what's in the Haggadah. And what's in the Haggadah? Well, a great deal of it, and it's often the parts that people don't find that interesting and they tend to skip over, but a good part of it is people discussing. So we are discussing during a Seder what's in the Haggadah, which is stories about people discussing the Exodus. And so there's a way in which, instead of calling Jews the people of the book, it might make more sense to call them the people of discussing, teaching, and learning about books. And that's what we're here for. That's what we're here for tonight. This year's Stroum Lecturer, Professor Susan Handelman, is a professor of English at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. She taught until the year 2000 at the University of Maryland, where she'd spent just about her whole professional career. She made Aliyah. She's teaching at Bar-Ilan, as I said. And she teaches about the novel, and she teaches about literary theory, and she teaches about teaching and learning, which is something that's at the heart of the Jewish experience. And to give you some sense, very briefly, of the kinds of things that she has been involved in, let me just mention the titles of a couple of articles that she has published. Stopping the Heart, The Spiritual Search of Students and the Challenge to a Professor in Undergraduate Literature Classes. Just as all their faces are different, the Jewish, the personal, and the pedagogical. She's the author, the editor, the co-editor of a great many, of a number of books. She co-edited a book called The Torah of the Mothers, Jewish Women Read Classical Jewish Texts. And in there, she has an essay, With Every Goodbye You Learn, Reflections on Leave-Taking and the Passing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now this year's lecture series is called Find Yourself a Teacher, the mentor-disciple relation in classical Jewish thought and contemporary practice. And today's lecture is Becoming a Living Book, and Your Eyes Shall See Your Teacher. Please welcome Professor Susan Handelman.
you. Okay. Being asked to give the Stroum Lectures, it's really like winning the Oscars in Jewish studies. It's a great honor, and it's very thrilling. And I want to take a minute or two just to set the broadest context for this lecture before we go into the Jewish aspect. Education. And now, let me just quote Steiner. He says, the need to transmit knowledge and skills and the desire to acquire them, that's constants of the human condition. Instruction and its acquisition have to continue as long as societies exist. Life, as we know, couldn't carry on without them. So it's just part of the human condition. We're always going to have schools and teachers. Actually, it reminds me of the story, you know, the debate about should we have prayers in public schools. And I always liked the person who said, as long as there will be math tests, there will always be prayers in public schools. I don't know, you know, about that debate, but we're always going to have schools and tests and teachers. Another person I want to quote to set the frame here is Hannah Arendt, who you may remember wrote that great book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, about the Eichmann trial. Hannah Arendt was a great German Jewish woman intellectual who was Heidegger, the great German philosopher who became a Nazi student. Now that student-teacher relationship was very complicated and turned into an erotic one. And even after it was revealed that he was a Nazi, she continued correspondence with him. It's very fascinating. In any case, she came to America after the war, like many of those great German Jewish intellectuals, and she wrote a wonderful essay called The Crisis in Education. And I think she has one of the best definitions of the overall issue that I've read. And I'm just going to sum it up. Here's her definition. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token save it from that ruin which, except for renewal and the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. Really interesting definition. Beautiful, isn't it? It's about what happens between generations. She says, and we can't leave it just to the issue of pedagogy. And education, she says, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices and give them the chance to renew a common world. Very, very beautiful, beautiful essay. So basically, it's an issue about what happens between generations. It's a fact of life. So whether you're a lawyer or a business person or a football coach, actually Steiner, who's the paradigm of the cosmopolitan European Jew, when he writes about American master-teacher relationships, he talks about Knut Rockne. I guess he has this kind of a little bit of a condescending attitude towards American culture, but it's true. A football coach, a car mechanic, everybody is in a situation of learning and teaching all our lives. The Maggid of Mezrich, who was a very famous Hasidic Rabbi, said, oh, this is a nice quote, "The universe can be understood only from the viewpoint of God's educational methods." So, and we know now, to move to the Jewish part, now that I've just kind of set the background, Torah means teaching. My title, as Paul said, comes from Pirkei Avot. Now, this is the time of year that many of you know in the Jewish calendar, between Passover and Shavuos, that we read Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers. So we're kind of fulfilling the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, especially by looking at that line. Aseh lecha rav ukaneh lecha chaver. Make, it's oftentimes translated, I think you did it in the publicity, I'm not sure. Find yourself a teacher and acquire a friend. Okay, that's the title. Now it's very interesting because in Hebrew, la'asot, aseh, means to make, to do. Not to find. There's really another verb for to find. Limtso, mitziah, lechapes, search out. So it says make yourself a teacher, or make of yourself a teacher, and acquire a friend. What does one have to do with the other? That's the first question. How does a student make a teacher for himself? How does a student become a student? How does a student find a teacher? And so, quote, make, make the teacher, give the teacher the teacher's identity. How does a student find his or her identity? And what's the relationship of having friends to teaching? I'm going to take 3 stories from the Talmud about teacher-student relationships in very climactic moments. And the first one is going to deal with Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. This is the time of the destruction of the temple, the Roman rule, very cruel, bitter rule over the land of Israel. And from the year you see 40 to 80 of the Common Era, you have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who witnesses the destruction of the temple and recreates in Yavne the Academy of Sages to save Judaism. And this is the time of Vespasian. And then his student, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, do you see that? In the year 80 to 110 CE. And then I'm going to talk in the story about Rabbi Eliezer and his great student, Rabbi Akiva, and then Monday on Rabbi Akiva and his students. So that's where we're located. So this is going to go chronologically as well. And the Talmud also tells us in this period of the year, Sfirat HaOmer, that the students of Rabbi Akiva, 24,000 of them died. And that's why now it's a period of semi-mourning in the Jewish calendar. And it says they died because they didn't have respect for each other. So we want to look at that in the third lecture. And here's Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, the leader of that very traumatic and troubled time. And he, it says there, received the tradition from Hillel and Shammai. And he had 5 disciples, 5 main students. Okay? And they're listed for you. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the hero of our story that we're going to look at, is first. Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach. You may recognize them from the Haggadah on Pesach. A lot of these people were mentioned in the Seder. In each one of these students, he describes in one word. Okay? And how does he describe Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? He says he's a bor sud. He's a plastered cistern that doesn't lose a drop. If you're a teacher and I asked you, are you a parent? And I said to you, describe your child or your student in one word, each one of them, as a very interesting and difficult task. So each one of them he describes in one word. And what summed up Rabbi Eliezer? The plastered cistern that doesn't lose a drop. So what does that mean? In Israel, we drink from the skies. There's no great, wonderful sources of flowing waters like you have all around here in this beautiful city, except for the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee fills up from the rain. There's no sea, no lake. So you have to capture the rainwater. And if you've been to Israel and you've seen these old ancient cisterns that are underground that would capture the rainwater and hold it and then be used for the winter, that's what he's making the analogy to Rabbi Eliezer is. Rabbi Eliezer held everything. He contained everything. It says in the Talmud, he never said anything he didn't hear from his teacher. Okay? And this theme of holding everything, containing everything, being empty and being full as a teacher is exactly the theme of the stories that we're going to look at. And what was his particular way of learning and teaching, of transmitting knowledge? That's the main issue that we're going to look at. Okay? Now we know a little bit about how his teacher saw him, what his characteristic was. And I want to give you one story as a background to the scene of his death that we're going to look at, where you see his relation to his disciples. Who was he? Now, if you look at the next page, you see, it says the Book of Legends. There's several versions of this story. And what Bialik and Ravitsky did, who lived about 100 years ago, they combined them all and put them together. So those of you who are academics know, of course, that there are different versions, but they put them all together. And I could actually do a whole lecture just on this wonderful story, but you need it as background for the one we're going to look at in depth. So I just want to sum it up, and your homework is that to go home and read it. It's in depth. It's really beautiful. In brief, as you see, Rabbi Eliezer was, at the age of 22, he hadn't studied anything. He hadn't studied Torah. But he came from a very rich family. And it's a wonderful scene that's set here, if you look there in the first paragraph. He's out there plowing very stony and hard ground. And his brothers are off plowing in the arable in a valley, and he's plowing a stony plot. Now, there's already a theme here of isolation. Why is he separated? He's separated from the brothers. He's plowing, and all these are going to be very symbolic for the process of learning and studying. And he sits down and he weeps. And we'll see the theme of him weeping through the stories that we're going to analyze. He's weeping, he cries. His father comes to him, and he asks him, why are you weeping? Are you upset because you have to plow this stony plot? Okay, I'll send you over to where it's easier to plow. Rabbi Eliezer says, no. His father says, so why are you weeping? I want to study Torah. It's kind of like, I guess, the father wants him to go into his business, but he wants to become an artist, and he doesn't want to follow, and he wants to go study Torah. He said, listen, you're 22 years old. This is not a time to change professions. Go, get married, take a wife, have children, and you'll take them to school. So clearly there's a tension. The father and the son. The father does not understand the son's yearnings. And we're going to see this in the stories. What's the difference between the father-son relationship and the Rav Talmid, the rabbi-disciple? But Rabbi Eliezer thinks, no, I'm going to study. I want to go to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the greatest teacher. His father says, oh, you won't get a taste of food until you plow the entire furrow. You see that line? Are you with me? Now, food, we all know this is a big issue for Jews. And it's also going to be very symbolic. You mentioned we are not the people of the book, we're the people of discussion. Professor Jaffe wrote a wonderful book called Torah in the Mouth. I like to say that we're the people of the mouth in many, many ways. The orality of oral Torah, the way the teachings come to life. So the food is a very big issue, and we're going to see that. You're not going to taste anything. He wants to taste Torah until you plow this. So what does he do? He gets up and he plows the furrow. And then, you all with me? Do you see? His heifer's leg, he falls and breaks his leg. And what does he say? Aha, it's a sign. My heifer's leg broke for my sake. In Hebrew, it's letovati nishbara regel parati. It sounds good. It sounds a lot better in Hebrew. Now, I was actually having discussion. People said, oh, you're going to Seattle. What are you going to talk about? So my old Hebrew teacher, who is now my friend, called me up before I left, wished me happy Passover, and I told her I was coming. She said, you're going to talk about Rabbi Eliezer? She says, oh, what a wonderful story. I love that story. So she said to me, I really love this. It's how we live these texts. She says, in my house, whenever anything happens, like the sofa breaks or the dishwasher breaks, or we have to buy a new one, we say, Latovati nishbara regel parati. For it was for my good that the heifer broke its leg. In other words, it's really for my good, and something good is going to come out of it. And I love that so much because it's the way in which these stories and texts are just part of the lived daily life of Jewish discourse, and especially in the land of Israel. So think about that. Next time your refrigerator breaks, think about Rabbi Eliezer. It's really, maybe there's a hidden reason and it's for your own good. Something good is, so what does he do? He takes it as a sign and runs off to Jerusalem, abandons his family to study with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And it was the eve of the Sabbath, and he hadn't eaten anything. Here's that theme of eating. By the way, a friend of mine had a great line about how can you define every Jewish holiday? If you have to define what are all the Jewish holidays about? We fought, we won, let's eat, right? He hadn't eaten anything, and it's Erev Shabbat, which you always have special meals, and he's walking along, and he's so hungry, and again, this is the theme for the hunger of learning. He picks up a pebble, and he puts it in his mouth. This is the situation of Rabbi Eliezer. He comes before Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, and he weeps again. Now, you see the parallel? The father, he was sitting before his father weeping. Now he's sitting before the great, and he's weeping. Again, he's weeping. Why are you weeping? I want to study Torah. You've never studied it. This is also an inspiration, by the way. He and Rabbi Akiva, who we're going to look at, Rabbi Akiva, according to tradition, didn't study till he was 40. So all of you or all of us who haven't studied, take it as a great inspiration. The greatest sages began late. Adult education can do a lot for you. So he began to teach him the Shema, the simple, simple things, and he repeated them and memorized them. But he hasn't eaten. Now, it's very interesting. If we were doing a whole lecture on this, I would ask you, I don't know why. He doesn't want to tell Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, why. I don't quite understand that. Maybe some of you have an idea. In the discussion period, we can talk about that. No, he keeps silent, and days go by. So he's not eating for days. So as you see at the end, what happens is a bad odor starts to come from his mouth. And Rabbi Eliezer notices this and figures out he hasn't been eating. And he sends the other disciples around to find out, what's happening to him? And the landlady says, well, he's has this sack, and he puts his head in it, and I thought he was eating, but they look in it, and it's just dust that he's sucking from. He's so hungry. So they go and report to Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. Now I'm at the bottom of that column, and he says, and here's the great line, even as this foul breath rose from your mouth, the fragrance of Torah, the oral Torah, the discussion, learning that you'll speak will issue out of your mouth and travel from one end of the world to the other. And he set up regular meals and becomes a great scholar. The end of the story, to summarize, is guess what? So what happened back at the ranch? Rabbi Eliezer's father and his brother said, oh, you ran away? Disinherit him. So his father comes to Jerusalem, and there's a feast day for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He sees the father, Hyrcanos. He sits them down, and he says to Rabbi Eliezer, begin your discourse. Now remember, Rabbi Eliezer, who's the bor sud, who's the plastered cistern, he holds everything in. He says, I can't say anything except what you taught me. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you're not the plastered cistern. You're the spring. You're the mayan. The spring wells up from itself. You're like that. Open and speak. And then he does. And of course, as you see here, it says, oh, it was so great. Nobody had ever heard such things. And his face was as radiant as the light of the sun. This is very important for some things I'm going to talk about. He had this shining face. And it was like the face of Moses. Remember, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and his face is shining, and he has to put on a veil. Remember Michelangelo, when he has that statue of Moses with the horns? Because in Hebrew, keren means light ray, and also means horns, and it was mistranslated, the karne hod, so it wound up with horns and Michelangelo, but it meant the shining, luminous face of the teacher teaching. And Rabbi Eliezer is very much identified with Moses, as we'll see. So then his father says, oh, what a great son I have, and I'm going to disinherit everybody else, and I'll give you, my son, everything. And he said, no, it's not what I wanted. I just wanted to learn Torah. Now, I'm not going to analyze this. This is just background. It's very important to know this. The next text, I'm not going to go into right now. This is from the middle of his life. It's the big dispute he had with the other sages. He becomes one of the greatest sages of Israel, one of the leaders, along with his brother-in-law, Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Yoshua, who were like the president of the court and the head of the Sanhedrin. Now we're into the text that I really want to focus on and analyze in depth, which is one of the most beautiful passages in the Talmud, and I think has some of the most powerful images about teacher-student relation. Okay? You with me here? At the top it says Sanhedrin, chapter 7. Now this that you're looking at, it's a page from the Talmud, but this is the Schottenstein Talmud, the translation. So the Talmud doesn't really look like this at all, but it's very readable. And what they have here is they have Hebrew, and the bold translates the Hebrew, and then they interpolate, because the Torah, the Talmud, is the oral traditions of interpretation, and it keeps its oral form. We're talking about the mouth and food and orality. The form of the Talmud isn't a linear narrative, like that midrash I just read. It's very coded. It requires a teacher to learn it. It wasn't supposed to be written down. Again, Professor Jaffe has written wonderful essays and books on this dialectic. So if you read it in the Hebrew, there's all kinds of gaps and enigmas, and it keeps that form to it. So what they try to do here is fill in some of that for you, but you'll feel it a little better. So this is my central text for tonight, and I'm going to read it line by line, okay? And we'll go back over it and see what's in it about the teacher-student relation. Let me just tell you the background of this. Sanhedrin is court, and this tractate is about various penalties, and the background of this story is about sorcery. And it's about if you practice sorcery, to what penalties might you be liable? And the Mishnah there, the text that it's going to comment, says that Rabbi Akiva learned from Rabbi Yeshua that if you just make illusions, and tricks, you're not liable to penalty. But if you actually do it and profit from it, you are, okay? Now, are you with me? It says, the Gemara asks here, this is the Talmud. Wait a minute, Gemara is always asking questions. Did Rabbi Akiva learn this from Rabbi Yeshua, this law about sorcery? No, it was taught in a Baraita, in an outside source, that he learned it from Rabbi Eliezer. And here's the story of the end of Rabbi Eliezer's life. Now remember everything from the beginning of his life about how he learned Torah and what the themes were. And now let's look at the end, okay? When Rabbi Eliezer fell ill, I'll read a little bit in Hebrew because I think it's good to hear a little Hebrew, K'shechala Rabbi Eliezer, nichnasu Rabbi Akiva v'chaverav levakro. Rabbi Akiva, that's his great student, who's going to play a big role in this version of the story, and his colleagues came to visit him. Hu yoshev b'kinuv shelo. Rabbi Eliezer was sitting in a kinuv, kind of means like a canopied bed. So he's very, very ill, and he's in a bed, kind of, in a room. Think of, as I read it, the geography. Think if you were Steven Spielberg and you were going to film this. How would these people, where would it be set, and how would the lines be read? I'm going to read it in a certain tone of voice, but there's a lot of option for interpretation there. So image an old man, ill, in a canopied bed. V'hen yoshvim betraklim shelo. And they sat, and the sages sat in his parlor. In other words, they didn't go into the bedroom. They're sitting outside. They're sitting in the hallway. All right? That's already a distance, some kind of distance. And what day was it? Ve'ato hayom erev Shabbat haya. It was the eve of the Sabbath. It was Friday afternoon, which is a very busy time for observant Jews because you have to get ready for the Sabbath. You have to light the candles. You have to heat everything up. After sunset, you can't do any of those things. So he's sick, and it's erev Shabbat. Nichnas Horkanus. Now his son is named Horkanus. His son is named after his father. His son goes in. Bano, lachlot tfilav, to take off the tefillin of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, tefillin, are the phylacteries. In Talmudic times, many people wore them the whole day. There are certain people that still do that. And on Shabbat, you don't wear them. That's a rabbinic prohibition. So he comes in to take off his father's tefillin. What happens? Ga'ar bo v'yatsa b'nizifa. Rabbi Eliezer rebuked him, and he left in shame. Remember the father-son tension? Again, here, Rabbi Eliezer's son, there's some problem here. He rebukes him very strongly, and he leaves ashamed. Why is this happening? We're going to ask these questions, and we'll go back over the text and look at it in more depth. Amar lehen l'chaverav. So he said, his son said to the colleagues, I think my father's lost it. I think my father's mind has gone crazy. Why? Everybody knows. You would assume you'd take the tefillin off on Shabbat. Shabbat is coming. It appears to me, Shadato shel Abba nitrafa. Rabbi Eliezer heard this. Now, obviously, the son went out, as you have to infer from it, he went out into the hallway and said this loudly to the other rabbis there. Clearly unaware or thinking that his father was so out of it that he wouldn't mind. As people tend to talk about people who are sick or older like that. I think he's gone crazy. Amarla, Rabbi Eliezer heard this. He overheard this, and he said to them, and again, I don't know if you were playing Rabbi Eliezer, who was a very sharp person, how you would say this, da'at tov da'at imo nitrafa, his mind and his mother's mind are muddled. How are they neglecting preparing for Shabbat, that is, lighting the candles and preparing everything, which biblically are a terrible prohibition if you don't do that, and punishable by stoning, and they're worrying about this more minor one of taking my tefillin off. So clearly from that it says once the sages realized that his mind he was okay. He was very sharp. He knew exactly what he was doing. Nichnasu v'yashvu lefanav mirachok arba amot. They entered his room, they come in, so a little more intimacy, and they sit before him at a distance of 4 amot. And amma is like from your, say, your elbow to the end. Now, why are they sitting apart from him? And you notice again, he's isolated here. We saw how isolated he was in his youth. We have to fill in a little gap here. If the previous page is the story about why they're sitting at a distance from him. He got excommunicated. There's a very famous story in Bava Metzia that you have on the previous page that many people have written a lot of commentaries on. But he was one of the greatest sages, and there was a huge dispute. Some of you may have remembered this story. And they're debating, he and the sages are debating about the ritual purity of a certain oven, because that was part of the, when the temple was standing. And he said that it was pure, and they said no, it was unpure. And they had, it was called the Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai, because the arguments, it says, wound around it like a snake. And they had a huge argument in the Beit Midrash. Again, you can read all this at home. I put it out there for you. And he would not accept it. He would not accept the arguments. And he had all these counter-arguments. He started bringing miraculous things. The stream is flowing backwards. The tree is torn up. They said, we don't accept those kinds of proofs. It has to go according to the majority. And he says, let a voice come from heaven, and a voice come from heaven and says, everything agrees with Rabbi Eliezer. Don't dispute with him. They say, we don't listen to a voice from heaven. Very famous line, Lo b'shamayim hi. You have to go after the majority the Torah is given on earth. He lost. Because what happened was his colleagues took a vote and they excommunicated him and burned everything that he had declared as pure. This was a huge trauma. Here was one of the greatest sages of Israel. At the bottom of that page, who was the one who was going to tell him, you are now excommunicated? Rabbi Akiva, the great sage. And that story goes on. Rabbi Akiva did this in a very delicate way. They were afraid if they sent someone else to say, you, Rabbi Eliezer, excommunicated, he would destroy the world. It's a terrible thing to do. So Rabbi Akiva donned black garments and sat at the distance of 4 cubits from him, because when a person is put in ban, you can't get close to them. You have to maintain that distance. So you see, that's why in this story of his death, they're at 4 cubits from him. And what did Rabbi Akiva say to him? It appears to me that your companions are holding aloof from you, which he understood meant he had been excommunicated. And in that story, he tears his garments and he takes off his shoes and he sits on the floor and he cries. There's our Rabbi Eliezer crying again. And the world is smitten. And it's a very beautiful story, and many people write about it. The only thing I want to say about that, they forget that the context of that story is not just about debate. In the Talmud, the context is about not hurting another person with words. And the story is brought in that context. If you see it, it says there a famous line, all the gates of prayer since the destruction of the temple have been locked except the gates of tears. And it brings this story about not to harm people with words. So even though he was excommunicated, there was a lot of sympathy in the text for him, for his pain. So here he is again, isolated, the end of his life. What happened to his disciples? Here's a great teacher who can't teach, who people aren't coming to anymore, who's the Bor Sid, who has so much to give. They come and they sit 4 cubits from him because he's been excommunicated. Now back to our story. He initiates the conversation. And now with all this background that you have, what does he say to them? And very interesting, he says, Amar lahem lama batem. Why did you come? I don't know what if we were putting this on stage, what tone of voice he would say it. Would it be mournful? Would it be angry? Would it be sad? And then he said to them, Amar lahem va'adak shav lama lo batem. And why didn't you come until now? Where have you been, my colleagues? And what do they answer? Amru lo haya lanu pnai. We were busy. We weren't free. Which is a very loaded thing, kind of a hint to the excommunication, or obviously very uncomfortable. We weren't free. what does he say to them? This is a really strong shift. Tameani im yamutu mitat atzmam. Interesting, I would be surprised if they would die a natural death. Oh, it's interesting that it's put there in the third person. Rabbi Akiva says to him, Sheli mahu, what will mine be? This is his great student, the great Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer replied, Shalcha kashay mishalahen, yours will be worse than theirs. We're going to talk about, on Monday, Rabbi Akiva in prison, and you may be familiar with the terrible story of how Rabbi Akiva died. We read the story of the 10 martyrs, remember, on Yom Kippur, who were brought out by the Romans and killed. It was such a terrible period, and living in Israel now, these texts really come alive to me in a way they haven't before, because we're also living in a very, very difficult time where we have violence and terror around us. Even in America, you have this Mel Gibson, right, making these movies about the horrific violence and brutality of the way the Romans persecuted the Jews at that time. And remember what happened to Rabbi Akiva, that the Romans combed his flesh with irons to kill him. And that story of his death, we'll look at that text in its context on Monday. But this is very interesting. We'll go. What is this all about? What is he saying here? And then there's these famous lines, your death will be worse than theirs. He says, Rabbi Eliezer takes his 2 arms, Natal shtei uzrotav, v'hinacham al libo, and he placed them on his heart. And he said, Oy lechem shtei zrotai, woe to you, my 2 arms, shehen b'shtei sifrei Torah sheniglalin, which are like 2 Torah scrolls that are being rolled up. I learned much Torah and I taught much Torah. Harbe Torah limadati veharbe Torah limadati. And I didn't diminish from my teacher's knowledge even as much as a dog laps from the sea. It's a very powerful image. You think of a dog lapping at the sea. That's all I took from them. And my students, I taught much. My students diminished my own only as much as the Hebrew word is there, kamichol b'shvoferet. Like a little paintbrush that you dip in a tube, a little dab. And then he continues. And furthermore, I learned 300 laws pertaining to a vivid bacheret. That's a form of leprosy and signs of distinguishing it. And nobody ever questioned me about them at all. And I learned, and the Gemara says maybe it was 3,000. And then you go back into the issue of sorcery. And pertaining to the planting of cucumbers, nobody even asked me about them except Rabbi Akiva, his great student. And he tells that they were once walking on the road, and Rabbi Akiva says, teach me the laws about doing this by magic. This is the original source, planting cucumbers. And I said the word, and the field filled up, and then he said, now teach me how to uproot them, and I did it, and they were regathered. Then they start asking him questions, and what do they ask him about? Tuma and Tahara. They start asking him the same questions that the whole debate in which he was excommunicated was about. And they ask him about a ball, a shoe, are these susceptible to Tuma? And he starts giving the answers. They're all tameh, they're all susceptible, and you can immerse them in a mikveh. And then they ask him, what about the law of a shoe? Like a shoemaker would have a last and create the shoe on it. What about that? And he says, that's tahor. And Yatsa nishmato b'tahara, his soul departed in purity. On the word tahor, on the word pure. What happened? Rabbi Yoshua, who was the one who excommunicated him, stands on his feet and proclaims, Hutar haneder, Hutar haneder, the vow is annulled. I take the vow back. He's already died, remember. And then the law is if somebody passes away, God forbid, on Shabbat, you can't move them. They stay there the whole time. So after Shabbat, they have the funeral. Rabbi Akiva reappears. He meets the funeral procession, and he's striking his flesh in pain until the blood is flowing to the ground. And he says, Avi, Avi, Rechav Yisrael Farashav, my father, chariot of Israel and its horsemen. He's citing what Elisha says when Elijah goes to heaven. And then he says, I have much money, but I don't have any money changer to give it to. What do I do with all my knowledge? And then the Talmud ends as saying, so we see from this that Rabbi Akiva learned this law about the cucumbers from Rabbi Eliezer, but he didn't understand it, and he learned it again from Rabbi Yoshua. Okay. Now, there's a lot here, and I could do 3 lectures just on this story. But this last part, I want to do the analysis. What's happening here? What is it telling us now about our subject? About teachers and students and knowledge and rabbis and life and death. If you were confused by this text, it's okay, because the Talmud is a book that asks you as many questions as you want to ask it. And every time you think you have a grasp on it, it kind of eludes you. I think Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach said, you read it and you understand it a little bit, and then you say, I don't understand it at all, and then something happens and I still don't know anything, but something connects to it. So we're going to try to understand it a little bit and see what it's telling us about our topic. What's very interesting there is the tension between the father and the son and the teacher and the student. It seems that Hyrcanus wants to take off his tefillin because, you're not supposed to wear it on Shabbat. On the other hand, it could be that he thinks his father is dying, and he wants to hasten that. He doesn't want the tefillin to be on a dead person. Now, the scolding of Rabbi Eliezer of the son is very poignant. Again, he's in the state of isolation. This is the teacher who can't give over. This is the teacher who's so full, and yet can't give to the student. What's happening there? Why do the sages do this? Are they asking him these questions, coming finally at the end of his life to recreate that teaching relationship, to get another drop from him? Or are they similarly under this time pressure? They want to relieve the ban. Here's the great teacher who's been shamed, excommunicated. Are they trying to get him to say the right answer this time? The ban, as we see in the end, isn't removed until he's passed away. So there's this sense, again, of the frustrations of the story and of his trying to maintain his dignity. And of him, and you say, well, why they have this really moving story with all the stuff about sorcery. You see how the story is put in the context of him dying in his teaching function, nevertheless, and him dying a natural death, and the worry about the kind of death that was going on as all the sages and the great chain of tradition was being destroyed because of the Roman persecution. And the whole immensity of his feelings of, the Torah scroll is closing, the identification of the person, this is my title, as the living book. There's something to this where you feel, I think we all feel, when someone passes away, a teacher, a beloved person who we learned with, that we don't really appreciate that till they're gone. We don't see how much we've really missed until we've gone. And that's part of the quotation there where he says, what Elisha says, Avi, Avi, my father, the chariots of Israel. Remember the story of Elijah and Elisha? I think I Xeroxed it for you. Is it on there? I thought I had it. Yes. You can read that at home. That's very powerful because that was the paradigm of the teacher-student relationship in the Bible. And remember that Elijah is taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Remember the movie Chariots of Fire? It came from this. And when they're separated, Elisha, his great student and disciple, doesn't want to separate from him. And he says, what should I give you? He says, I want twice your spirit. And he says, if you see me when I'm taken from you, you will get it. And these horses and chariot of fire come up and separate them. And that's what he cries, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horses. And you have sources that I gave you that said that's why disciples are called sons, children. So that's what Rabbi Akiva cries out at that moment. Rabbi Eliezer was also a very fiery personality, like Elijah, as you see in that story of the debate with the oven of Achnai. And he's interesting also because Elijah, if he's identified, Elijah doesn't die. He's taken up to heaven. What is the text also telling us about what happens when teachers pass from us? Do they really pass from us also? Do they really depart from us? They, in a sense, live on. They're there and not there. And in the way that story ends, by tying it back to Elijah, I think it's saying the same thing about him. I was preparing this, and I learned it with my study partner in Jerusalem, Gila Rosen, and she had a very poignant way of reading this. Rabbi Eliezer's crying for light You know, he's saying, you know, go, what are you bothering with the tefillin for? Light the Shabbat candles. And here's a person at the end of their life calling out for light, feeling the need for this, feeling the need to psychologically avoid that darkness and that separation. And so all the legal discussion is kind of embodying the poignant emotional part of it. The philosopher Emanuel Levinas, who has wonderful philosophical readings of the Talmud, says the same thing about that strange ending. What is this? He's dying about analyzing the ritual purity of a shoe. What kind of an ending is that? And there's a very beautiful thing that Levinas says. He's died a few years ago. He's a French Jewish philosopher. He said, he breathed his last in the purity of the shoe. He says, but that precisely is what purity is. It's not about holy intentions and, you know, being New Age spirituality, but trying to bring this sanctification objectively to its ultimate, to the purity of a shoe. He says, if you would tell a passerby or a journalist that a great man of Israel died in purity because he stated that a shoe was pure, he would laugh at you. And he would publish your story in a boxed article in Le Monde to make a crowd of sneerers sneer. But he said, that is really the greatness of the ending of this story. You see him as a teacher at the end, lifted up in that liminal sharp state, and the tahor that he says there shows that all his intentions were pure at the end. There's a beautiful, again, I quoted the Maggid of Mezrich. He has a beautiful line. He says, I didn't go to my Rebbe to learn Torah from him. I went to him to see how he tied his shoes. There's a lot in a shoe. That's the living book. That's the analogy that Rabbi Eliezer gives. I'm the living scroll of Torah. If you look at the graphic pictures that I put on the front of that, look at it. Here you have the analogy. Here's Rabbi Eliezer says, my arms are like two, you have the rollers. As he analogizes his arms to those two, and here you see this scroll open and being closed, closing up. That identification of the sage with the living book is so much of what the story is about. It's like going to the teacher to see how he ties his shoelaces, because that can tell you everything. That's where you can really see the depth of the Torah. I was flying over here from Israel on El Al, and I was reading the New York Times, you know, on the plane, and there was a very interesting article about the World Trade Center and the reconstruction of it. And they had some very powerful interviews. And one was a man who was near the site, and he said this shoe blew over onto his balcony. And that one shoe, there was a whole world. The same thing if you've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington and you've seen that room of shoes. So this ending of what he is talking about and what Levinas says about what that meant and what was lost with that, what world of teaching, what world of life, how the Torah became life with him is the essence of this. Remember, he was the one who was the cistern who didn't lose a thing and he couldn't give it. Now, the last part I want to talk about, a beautiful analysis in more depth of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, was one of the greatest rabbis and teachers of our time, came from Europe, great Talmudist and philosopher. And he has a fascinating essay, which is the heart of this aspect of the teacher-student relationship. It's called The Jew is Like a Sefer Torah. I want to broaden out. Now, we went into depth in this text and broaden it out to the whole larger issue of what is the book, what is the living book, what's the relation of the Torah to the person in rabbinic and Jewish tradition. And he said, every Jew is likened to a Sefer Torah. That's, I think, the larger message. It's not just about this great sage who contained thousands and thousands of laws and represented that mode of learning and teaching. It's about every Jew and their relationship to the Torah. He says that it isn't just, Rabbi Soloveitchik, it's not just a beautiful metaphor. Oh, you know how poignant, my arms are rolling up, I'm like the Sefer Torah. It's very interesting, by the way, that position that he's holding, and arms which represent grasping in the heart. This is a fundamental halachic legal axiom, Rabbi Soloveitchik points out, in the Torah. It says that if you, God forbid, are present at the side of a person when they die, even if you're not a relative, you have to tear kriya. You have to, you know, and the sign of mourning is to tear a garment at the passing of that person. Why? It's not your relative. Why? The Talmud says because the passing of a person is like a Sefer Torah, the scroll of a Torah that has been burnt, and that requires tearing. The Torah is like a living being. And when it's burnt, one buries it next to a Torah scholar. So when you're next to, any Jew, it's not Rabbi Eliezer, any Jew, even if they don't know anything, if you're present at their passing, you have to tear Kriya because that's like a Sefer Torah that has been burnt. Every Jew is like a Sefer Torah. Many, many fascinating parallels, but we don't have time for that. But you see that exemplified in that image of Rabbi Eliezer. Now what Rabbi Soloveitchik says, Rabbi Soloveitchik was a great philosopher and thinker, existentialist, and he says something very poignant that broadens this out to teacher-student relationships. And think about it in all your teaching and student activities, whether you're a student on campus or a parent or an apprentice or a teacher of any sort. He says it's really, there's a tragedy in any great teacher, not just Rabbi Eliezer, who was excommunicated, put in ban. He says, because a student can always only learn a small portion of what the teacher has to give. I know for myself, you can imagine the hundreds of hours, maybe thousands of hours I've prepared. I have so much I want to say to you. I have so much, I can't give it over to you right now. I'm giving you, I feel like Rabbi Eliezer, I'm giving you like this little drop. It's interesting in that analogy, he said his students were like the paintbrush and he was like the dog, who was more flattered. You know, he kind of gives a more flattering metaphor to his students than himself. I can only give you a drop. It's almost, maybe as a parent, there's so much you want to give to your child. How much can you give? How much do they take from you? So he says this is inherent. It's an inherent kind of tragedy almost in the situation that the student can only take a small portion. And what was the greatness of Moses? Because when Rabbi Eliezer does that, I'm like the Sefer Torah rolling up. Moses is the one who gave the Torah. The Talmud says Moses was called the great sofer, the great scribe. You know, he wrote down the Torah. You have the image of the scribe there. So what's so great about that? He says a very beautiful thing. He says, what he really did was he transformed every Jew into the Sefer Torah. He inscribed it in the heart. That's the living book aspect. And what education is about, going back to the original larger issue of what's education, it's to make those letters written on the parchment of the person. That's what you want to do with the child. That's what you want to do with anybody. Inscribe that on the body. Make it part of them, not external to them. He wrote a very beautiful commentary of Soloveitchik. There's a very famous midrash that says, very interesting, Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, when Moses wrote the Torah, there was a little drop of ink left over in the quill. You have the picture of the sage there. And what did he do? It said he waved it around his head, and that became the rays of glory. Remember at the beginning when Rabbi Eliezer gets up and he gives his discourse and it says his face was shining like the rays from the face of Moshe? And when Moshe got the Torah, his face was shining. And it was so intense he had to put a veil on his face. That little drop that was left became those rays. What does that mean? It says he didn't know his face shone. What does that mean? Rav Soloveitchik, Joseph Soloveitchik says, beautiful thing. He says, as we said before, every great person, no matter how many books they write, or lectures they give, or teachings they give, most of the teaching remains with him or her, because there's a way in which you can't pass it on. Like Rabbi Eliezer says, much did I learn and much did I teach. So he says that little drop of ink that was left over, that was all the greatness that he couldn't give over, that was left, right? That he couldn't pass down and stayed with him. But that's the radiance. Where do you get that? We're not the people of the book. Where do you get that? You get that in the live-teacher-student relationship. That's the other side of it. Maybe it's not in the book, but maybe it's in the way that they tie their shoelaces. Maybe that's all the student is going to remember from the class, was the way the Rebbe tied their shoelaces. And that embodied, or the face of the Rebbe as they talked. I just had a Seder with my mother in Chicago. She's quite elderly now, thank God she's okay. She's the youngest of 8 children. Came from a European family. And in those days, women, you know, they weren't really, didn't have an opportunity to learn. Most of you who remember that period, parents know that. And they grew up in Chicago, and her father was a real Talmud scholar, but you know, he couldn't pass it down. It was America. He said, when his brother came and said, should I come and emigrate to America? He said, no, don't come because it's a treif of Welt. So I never knew him. I never knew him. And my mother couldn't, you know, she couldn't go to school. She couldn't really learn. Later on, she went back and did a degree in Jewish studies as an adult, kind of like Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. But when we come to the Seder and we sing Dayenu, her face, she dropped 30 years. Her face was shining. That was that moment, I think, that is talking about, too. That's the luminous face where she saw the face of her father and his face shining as they sang Dayenu, because on that night, he again was restored to his position. You know, what could he do in America? The Talmud scholar, he had to peddle linens door to door to make a living. But on that night, he was once again, he had the shining face. And that, I think, is what Rav Soloveitchik is saying about every Jew is identified with the Sefer Torah. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer is teaching. Thank you for your attention. And I hope to see you back on